Right, well, good morning, everybody. Sorry, good afternoon, I should say. Welcome along to this talk all about Pacific oysters. This talk's all about a project of Cornwall Wildlife Trust and working with Natural England and also South Devon AONB. You're going to hear all about it. My phone just started ringing, typical that my wife ringing me just as I stop recording. So here we go anyway. So the Pacific Oyster Project is a 2-year project that Cornwall Wildlife Trust have been working on alongside other partners, Natural England and South Devon AONB. So for those of you who haven't heard about what I do, my name is Matt Slater and I run a project called Shore Search Cornwall with Cornwall Wildlife Trust, as well as several other projects. And Shore Search is really great fun. We go out recording wildlife on the shore, and we've got a great network of volunteers all around the county, which has been really invaluable in this Pacific oyster work. So there's a shot of myself. My link to oysters goes back quite a long way. That was when I actually had hair, a very long time ago. I used to work as an oyster fisherman down on the Fowl after I did my degree, and it's a great way to spend the winter. And a fantastic traditional fishery exists down there for the native oysters. Now, telling the difference between your oysters is very important. So I've got a couple of slides here that will explain the difference. So press the button. So yeah, so this is a picture of a native oyster. It's quite a small oyster, also known as the flat oyster. And it has one shell which is flat and the other shell which is cupped. It's rarely attached to rocks and certainly never cemented onto rocks on the intertidal like the Pacific oysters are. It generally is found below the low water marks and subtidal area and in sheltered estuarine habitats only. It's pretty rare nationally, and certainly it's very rarely found on the shore, mainly on extreme low tide that you'd see on the shoreline. Quite common in the Fowl and Helford. When they open up, the aperture, which is the gap between the two shells, is virtually straight. So that's another good way of telling them apart from the Pacific oyster. And the frills all around the shell are quite sort of quite low key, quite small little frilly bits. Okay, the Pacific oyster is quite different, and it's the one that you find on the intertidal, so on the rocky shore, between sort of upper mid and low shore. If you find oysters attached to the rocks, they are nearly always going to be Pacific oysters. They're quite different. They're very variable in shape, and often you find one of the shells, the lower valve of the shell, is completely cemented to rocks. It has a more wavy aperture, so you can see there a zigzaggy opening when that oyster opens, with large frills along the edge. Sometimes you get little black patches or purple patches as well. And this is the species that is forming oyster reefs at the moment in our estuaries. So yeah, so Pacific oyster is a non-native species, obviously, as the name suggests, from the Pacific. And although it's mainly being found on the intertidal, in other parts of the world, it does live subtidally. And when it spreads to subtidal habitats, it could then outcompete other species, such as the native oyster, which is so important in the fowls that, as you saw from the photos of the fishery. And they're highly reproductive, so each oyster can produce up to 200 million larvae per spawning, and they can have several spawnings. And there has certainly been successful spatfuls in the last few years, because Pacific oysters, as you all know, are starting to show up all around the coast of Cornwall. They're an important species for aquaculture, and they've been farmed in Europe for a very long period of time. Back in the 1960s, well, earlier even, 50s and 60s, the government advice was that it would be species that couldn't reproduce in other waters, or would be very unlikely to reproduce. And the government advice at the time was it was fine to grow these as an aquaculture species. And certainly, you know, since that time, there's been a big expansion of aquaculture of Pacific oysters in the UK and all across Europe. And now the instructions given to those oyster fishermen came from governments, and none of those fishermen would have broken rules or anything like that. So it's unfair really to sort of point fingers and say that it's their fault that we've now got lots of feral oysters. In fact, you know, there could be lots of different reasons. It may be very little to do with agriculture as to why we've got feral oysters. And really where they've come from is not of our concern now that we've got a widespread viable feral population all across the UK, and certainly very a big one in the southwest, but there's also populations like this all across Europe. And really the question isn't why or where they've come from, it's more what can be done about it, or should something be done about it. So with these sort of concerns, there's certainly lots of more sightings of oysters being recorded. A 2-year project was applied for by Natural England, by Casvedel and her colleagues, and they managed to get funding from the European Marine Fisheries Fund. And we're very pleased to have been asked to coordinate the volunteer work in Cornwall, and South Devon AONB coordinating volunteer work in South Devon, with Natural England as the lead partner. So this project has been going now for nearly 2 years, and it's just coming up towards the end of the project. So I thought it would be a good time to have an update with you all about what's been going on. So the aims of the project were to mobilise citizen scientists, volunteers, to survey and record the oysters with a focus on marine protected areas, and also to trial manual control methods where those are appropriate, and to investigate alternative uses for the oysters. Just bear with me a minute, I'm just going to press the button here again. There we go. So we carried out with teams of volunteers all around Cornwall lots of surveys, and lots of people in the audience today have done this. So thank you to those who've been running and taking part in the surveys. And really counting the numbers of oysters and looking at densities as well on the shore. And what was really notable is that Pacific oysters have become very widespread. In some areas, particularly our estuaries, there's always been a few Pacific oysters, and now we're noticing this reef formation where oysters growing on oysters are really taking over the intertidal. And in these areas, we feel, and other biologists feel, that the oysters have a massive potential to alter the habitats, potentially for the worse. So what can they do? Well, they can on intertidal soft banks where you've got sand, gravel, and mud, you can end up with oysters smothering and covering that area, which does change. Now, whether it increases biodiversity, it may do in some areas, but in other areas it might also homogenise the biodiversity. That means you end up with a small number of species, a smaller number than you had in the beginning. And another potential impact is that it creates a barrier so that birds and fish, which may feed on fauna, which is invertebrates, worms, etc., in the mud or the sand, this barrier prevents predators of getting them. So it could actually impact on our food chains. On rocky shores, it has a less immediate or less obvious impact because rocky shores are already a hard structure. But eventually, we've seen, certainly within the southwest, but also globally, we've seen harbours and slipways and places like that getting completely covered eventually in oysters, which does have an impact. Another impact is the potential of risk to humans. They're sharp, and we've also had stories of as well as people cutting their feet, dogs as well, pets cutting their feet, inflatable dinghies being punctured, and then you look at it from a harbour master's perspective, it could also eventually become a hazard to shipping. If reefs become large enough, you could end up in them restricting the depth of estuaries and potentially becoming a hazard to shipping. Some of the oysters grow pretty big. This is a picture taken on one of our surveys. I think this is in the Fowls. This is an oyster which is bigger than my hand. They can get to a good weight as well. So one of the aspects of the project, as well as counting the oysters, we also wanted to look at whether it was worth worth manually controlling oysters. Now, manual culling or smashing of oysters has been carried out in other parts of the world, and it's been shown to be effective by Kent Wildlife Trust's Coast Busters project, and which was again quite closely studied. So we decided it would be interesting to do some work looking at manual culling in Cornwall as well as recording them to see if it's going to be an effective tool. Obviously, those who are concerned, the oysters get killed using a hammer. They're killed instantly by smashing the hole in the shell. The meat is left in situ, so we're not moving anything. That then gets scavenged by local creatures, crabs, birds, etc. What we found is that manual controlling is only really effective on oysters that are firmly attached to a rock. If you're kind of hit an oyster that's on sand or mud, it will move and it makes it a lot harder to break the shell. So those ones need to really be physically picked up to remove them from the area. And actually we felt with our volunteer groups that's probably outside what we would ask of volunteers because of the sheer quantities and the weights involved. We were only able to carry out culling where we had the landowner's permission, and we made sure that we got permissions from all of the relevant authorities, including Cornwall IFCA and anyone else involved, the harbour masters, etc. And we avoided culling on busy times, so we avoided school holidays, the whole of the summer, summer holidays. And this is what we've been finding. There's large areas of rocky shore covered in oysters, and this is actually down on the bit of shore along the east side of the Fal estuary, which is a huge rocky area, which is really getting dominated by oysters. And we also carried out a training day up on the Yelm estuary, or Yam estuary, I think they call it, don't they, in Devon. And that's an area which has had Pacific oyster reefs for a very long time. And it was really shocking to see this slipway in particular that was completely covered in Pacific oysters. It's certainly unusable for dinghy launching trolleys, etc. And what we've also seen is that oysters are forming new reefs in numerous locations. This one's in the Fal estuary, and where oysters start growing on soft sediments, they'll often attach to each other. Because obviously the spat travel around looking for suitable places to live, and they start to grow upright, almost like little, little chisels, very sharp. And this is a massive, this is a huge oyster. Stuck several other oysters. So whereabouts are the oysters across Cornwall? Sorry about quite an amateurish map. We're hoping to get some more professional looking maps done for the final report. But this shows you that oysters, the main concentration of oysters is within the estuaries, Cornwall, Helford, and we've got Foy and we've got the Tamar are the main areas where large densities of oysters are being found. But what's surprising is we're also starting to see Pacific oysters in some unusual, more open locations such as Whipsand Bay, Parr, St Austell Bay, St Ives Bay, Mounts Bay. So we wouldn't really expect Pacific oysters to be in those sort of habitats, but they're quite opportunistic and quite adaptable. So over the period of the 2 years in Cornwall, we recruited 12 volunteer groups who carried out 133 surveys in total, and a total of 133,000 oysters were counted, and a large number manually controlled. Any oysters that we found on the shore that we felt were marketable, the fishermen, we left in situ, and I'll talk a bit more about that. So we were definitely careful not to harm native oysters, and we were definitely careful not to harm oysters that may be of potential use to our fishing industry. Sorry. So that's a big thank you. That is a huge number, 130,000 oysters. It's incredible. And so this is the list of all the groups that have been involved, and we really appreciate all their hard work. Couldn't find it out. What we've noticed in the second year of the project, and this winter particularly, is that although a large number of areas have been cleared as well as we can of oysters, there was a lot more recruitment again this year. And these are small. This is a small oyster. Gives you a bit of scale there. You can see it's next to a limpet. It's probably about an inch across. So it's a very small flat oyster with that sort of purple pattern on it, and it makes them very hard to see actually. And certainly these mild winters we've been having, warm summers, probably conducive to further heavy recruitment. So the question is, what do we do? Do we carry on with this project? Talking about that. Is the culling itself worthwhile? It's a question that is worth considering. The culling certainly appears to be effective at controlling oysters that are stuck to rocks and harbour walls. However, you will never get every last one, no matter how hard you try. And if you go back over an area, you certainly do find it is easy to miss a few. It doesn't really work on soft intertidal, as we already discussed, and they need picking. And I didn't really feel in our area that would be fair. But in the Helford, be fair to the guys at the Helford, they've done a great job of picking and collecting oysters there. So it can be done. It's just you have to sort of think about what can be done with the oysters and about health and safety very carefully. But generally, I feel that culling is, we know it is, we've seen it has been effective, but it's probably only really going to be part of the solution. And if we're to keep Pacific oysters under control, to prevent them really changing our estuaries and our ecosystems, we're going to have to look at other options as well. And I think really there is a big need to find a commercial value. I don't think it's really fair to expect the government to prioritise controlling Pacific oysters necessarily in future years. And times are tough. The sensible option would be to try and come up with some commercial use for the oysters themselves. Now, some of the oysters we found, like this one, looked very, very marketable. This is a nice oyster, just almost exactly the same in appearance as the ones that the farms produce. So presumably there should be a market for these feral oysters. And through our work with the Cornwall Good Seafood Guide, we've actually been sending samples of these that have been purified off to chefs, and chefs have been giving us good feedback. And we get reports from some of the processors that there is a slowly emerging market for feral oysters, but it's a tricky market. And oysters, they're kind of going to be competing with the farmed oysters, which is troublesome. And yeah, not immediately the answer, I don't think. And certainly there's many areas of Cornwall where you're not allowed to legally collect oysters, because oysters can only be collected from designated shellfish areas where the water conditions are tested regularly. And then the oysters obviously need to be purified properly before they're then sold. So we certainly aren't ever going to be encouraging people to go out and just start helping themselves to oysters, because of all these legal considerations that are there for human safety, food safety. So they need to be purified. There is, with such a large resource out there, surely there could be other avenues. They could be processed by cooking, potentially tinning, pickling, etc. And there's lots of other countries where that is very successful. But there are clearly barriers that that affect the profit margins. The biggest one being they have to be depurated in a purification tank before they're sold, and the fact there's only limited areas. The other problem is they're not a uniform shape, unlike the farmed oysters. As you saw, they're very wonky. So yeah, there's quite a few barriers there. But we've actually produced some materials through the Seafood Guide, including a small short film that's going to be released later on this month, which sort of encourages chefs to consider using Pacific oysters. So another option is to look at non-food uses, and there's several things they can be used, ways they can be used. They can be composted, they can be ground up and used as an ingredient for soil conditioner. The shell can be put to other uses. Calcium carbonate is the main ingredient in the shell, which is very useful. The protein in the meat could be used, but there are several barriers, and one of the main barriers at the moment is the fact that it's currently illegal to put oysters straight onto fields or into compost. They have to be heat treated. That's down to the animal byproduct order, and that really does hit the profit margins and sort of put off people getting involved, I think. So it'd be good to try and get the powers that be to sort of think laterally and look at whether there is ways of controlling this and doing some trials of actually putting them directly onto fields or compost, because yeah, it'd be good to have some studies done to find out, because personally I feel that the risks of that probably worth looking into. I don't think they're going to be as bad as people think. Anyway, more work to be done on that. So what outputs are there of the 2-year project for you guys to expect? Well, we're shortly going to be, shortly a detailed report is going to be published by Natural England, and Adele's going to tell you about how that's coming along. That's going to have taken all of the brilliant data collected by our volunteers, not just in Cornwall, but also Devon, and present it to us all. And something that's really helped as well with that process is that some students from the University of Exeter, led by Ben Coulson, who I think is in the audience, thank you, Ben. He's put together a really great literature review, which is going to be very valuable to our project. They've looked at what's been going on in other countries and what we can learn from other people, so that's going to be really helpful. There's some work going on that Adele will tell you a bit about, which is a demonstration trial of creating soil conditioner. Currently that's on hold, sadly, for the coronavirus. So yeah, those are the outputs of our project. So I'm going to hand over now to Nigel from South Devon. Hi, Nigel. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and then allow you to share your screen, Nigel. So, okay. Yeah. Have you got a share screen button on your?
I have. I think you need to allow me to use it.
Okay, cool. How do I do that?
So at the bottom of your screen, Matt, there's a shield that says security.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And then allow participants to share screen. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, that one. Share. And there. Okay. Well, actually, I guess you can all see me what I look like anyway, so we can bypass the first slide. And I'd just like to say thank you very much to all the volunteers that have helped in all your different ways with the surveys and the bashes that we've been doing. This is one of our first in Salcombe. This is one with local volunteers for the community in the Elm. And that's one where we were collecting to give to the local oyster farmer. Some were going for composting, and some were just being bashed. And we just discovered that we could cover the same bit of foreshore 3 or 4 times and still find oysters. We've done a concerted effort around the Salcombe Kingsbridge estuary. These are all the different surveys that we've carried out there. And this is one estuary where we do feel that we could probably have a reasonable impact on the numbers around the estuary if we kept on going with it. We'll come back to that one in a second. The Yelm, unfortunately, got tied up with the lockdown and COVID. So we haven't done as many oyster surveys there as we would really have liked to, even though the Yelm for South Devon is easily the worst area, or I should say, the worst area we've come across yet in South Devon. So whether we will have the time and resources to do that in the future, I don't know, but we would certainly like to. In some of our places, it got to the extent where the local community put signs up warning people about the dangers of using the beach, either for people's feet or dogs' paws. We've certainly learnt about the small ones. This was one from the Dart that really confused us for some time, but it's interesting, Matt, you were saying about the purple stripes, so maybe it's just an indicator of a young one. This is one of our biggies that we found, and that one surprised us because you start getting your eye in, as you know.
Nigel, we can't hear you.
So sorry about this. Nigel has gone quiet, and I'm not sure why. It may be because we're nearing the end of our time allowance.
It shouldn't be that. It might be, yeah, maybe Joanna said the headset might have pulled out.
Okay. Yeah. Hello, Nigel. Can you hear us now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. You managed to mute yourself a little while back. I think it might be your headset.
Oh, I don't know how. I think it's. Let me try again.
Yeah. Just to warn everybody that the presentation, we've only got 40 minutes apparently. It may keep going or it may not, but if it stops, we'll go to the second meeting. Should have about another 5 minutes, Nigel.
Okay.
And then we'll go
Can
to the
you
second
hear
meeting.
me now?
I can hear you now perfectly, yeah.
Great. Okay.
Sorry,
Okay. To carry on, then, we certainly found that oysters seem to attract more oysters. The spat are obviously going for where the adults already are. Can I go forward? Yeah, and also they particularly seem to like ironwork. You know, man-made structures on the foreshore. They really seem to go for, which is, you know, we've been advised in the past within our biosecurity plans to try and get rid of any infrastructure off the shore that's no longer needed to try and avoid that. There were some concerns about the oysters that we were bashing, that we were leaving these big white scars, but we found that periwinkles and limpets actually seem to go for these and settle onto them. And where we might have always said limpets will always go back to the home scar, now we're finding some that have moved onto the oyster shell, which is interesting, and they do mute down fairly quickly. We found a reasonable number of native oysters, particularly around the Salk and Kingsbridge estuary. Don't know why, but that's fantastic, and we would in every way like to encourage that. If we'd found enough, we would have collected them together and put them all in one spot just to try and enhance the chances of their reproducing. This is an area we found out in the Salk and Kingsbridge estuary. If you look really carefully, you can see green around those oysters, and that's dwarf seagrass. And we're very concerned that the oysters there may well, if we leave them there, sort of displace the dwarf seagrass there. So what we found is that they've settled there. Probably, if you can see there in the center, that oyster appears to have settled onto a cockle shell. And that's how we think that these oysters are being successful, settling onto what would otherwise be mudflats and not attractive to them. So with colleagues from Natural England, we visited the site and we found that a possible way of getting rid of them, yes, Adele, that's you there, is to actually trample them down into the mud. We don't believe that they have the biology to come back up again. And also, if you have something like a piece of scaffolding pole, where you've got the sensitivity of the seagrass as well, you can actually push them down into the mud. And like I said, they shouldn't come back. Unfortunately, with lockdown, I'm not allowed to kayak over that area yet, but I've got every reason to believe that's been quite successful. From my point of view, I've really enjoyed working with some tremendous volunteers and getting out to some lovely spots. Here's us out in our canoe, and it's just reinforced that I should get out more. This is an area of dwarf seagrass over a huge area of the Salk and Kingsbridge estuary. And lastly, we've actually discovered at least one brand new seagrass meadow. This one again within the Salk and Kingsbridge estuary, but we also believe we might have found a new one somewhere within the mouth of the estuary. But again, we've not been able to get back on a low enough tide to find it, but we hope. Any questions?
Thanks, Nigel. I think one of the interesting things from that literature review was the fact that Pacific oysters can out-compete in seagrass. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. It's a really great report. It's still not perfectly finished. So anyway, we've got time just for a few words from Adele, and then I think we'll be near to the end of our meeting. So
you've got 1 minute left. I would suggest that you share, if you have set up a second meeting, that you share the link in the chat now, and people can log into that.
Or I could just email it to everybody in the same way as I emailed the other link. Yeah, I've got it all ready to press send, that email. So yeah, so thank you everybody. We'll end the meeting and we'll start up a new one where we just have a discussion. And yeah, it says less than 1 minute, so we haven't even got time for a doubt. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Right. See you in a moment.